New York, New York. 8.4 million people call the city home.
24 degrees, snowing hard in Central Park, going down to 20 in Midtown. Snowfall 1 to 2 feet.
So they're now saying we could have snow falling as rapidly as 5 inches an hour.
This has been the coldest winter here in 81 years, and it coincides with a grim reality. More people in New York City are homeless today than at any point since the 1930s.
It's a citywide cold blue. We've got 3 floors open today.
It's really difficult, especially to find ways to just get through day to day, from finding clothing to finding shelter to finding where you're going to eat.
Tonight it's pretty hectic because of the snow outside and not a lot of places for us to sleep now, so everybody's kind of coming in.
In just a decade, the number of people living in New York's homeless shelters has nearly doubled, reaching 60,000 a night last year. It's a homelessness crisis unprecedented in any American city.
What we see today, the homeless that we see, the exodus from the city, families doubling, tripling up, the rent skyrocketing. This has been a crisis that's been cooking for 20 years.
Why are so many in New York homeless? This week, Fault Lines looks at the forces that are displacing thousands from their homes. We're on our way to the South Bronx, to New York's only intake center for homeless families. More than 70% of people in the city's shelters are families with children.
Homelessness is so complicated. It's not just this guy on the street with that shopping cart. And it isn't just this one person who made the wrong choice or had bad luck.
To apply for shelter, a family must first come to this building, known as PATH. Journalists are not allowed inside.
We've been here just a few hours and there's been dozens of families coming in. It's been really shocking. It's a lot of young children and a lot of working parents trying to make it. What's it like in there?
It's not what people think. People in there, everyday people. I don't judge people because you never know the situation you'll be in,
I have 4 kids. My salary, I get paid $9 an hour. So you do the math.
How did you know about the PATH Center?
I Googled it. I Googled family shelters. Yes, baby. I Googled it.
Is this your first time in the shelter system?
Yeah.
And what's this little guy's name?
This is Josiah Grubb. Say hi, Josiah.
Hi, Josiah. How old are you, Josiah?
3.
So where are you sleeping? Where are you staying these days?
Man, wherever they place you come in, they'll put you on a 10-day placement, and then they'll be like, okay, you either denied or approved. If you
and if you're denied?
If you denied, you have to come back and do the process all over again.
That's what you're doing now.
For the 3rd time.
New York City has an obligation to provide shelter to all individuals who are homeless. Because of that tradition, New York City has the largest public shelter system in the United States.
Patrick Marquis is one of New York's leading advocates for the homeless.
The cost of shelter is exorbitant. The city now spends more than $1 billion a year just in shelter and emergency services for homeless people.
Today, New York operates over 250 homeless shelters. But still, about half of the families who apply for shelter are rejected.
The city has put in place these kind of bureaucratic barriers that wrongfully and unlawfully deny shelter to many needy families.
Come here, Nevi. Help me with your brothers.
We met Melissa Rivera at PATH. She's 25 and has 3 kids.
I go through this every single day when I come home. Come here. And then come stay with mommy. Stop crying. She's my little mini-me. She looks just like me.
These kids mean everything to you, huh?
Yes. They're my life. I love them dearly. My babies.
Melissa has been homeless for 3 years. She and her kids now sleep in the living room of her grandmother's public housing unit.
This is it right here. I put this couch, I bring it over, put it together with that one, put the blankets on there, and we
So you all sleep right here in the
just
living
me
room?
and my 2 daughters, and then my son right in here.
Yep.
His playpen.
New York's Child Services Agency has told Melissa that she's endangering her kids by keeping them here.
How does your grandmother feel about you living right here in her living room?
She hates it.
Her grandmother is also at risk of losing her housing subsidy. But still, she says the city has denied her shelter application 7 times. Melissa works as a door-to-door saleswoman, but she only makes about $400 a month.
Have you ever had to sleep on the streets?
Not with my kids, thank God. I have gone through it on my own when I was 16, and I don't want that life for them. So, sorry.
It's okay.
Just thinking about that they could be in the situation that I was in before. Knowing that I'm by myself is a lot of things that I would love to have, but it's so expensive. I don't make enough to get any of those things. It is New York, there's a lot of rich people here. They want to make the city for people that can afford things. You know, forget about the people that can't afford it. They're just gonna have to leave the city. That's how I see it.
1 in 5 New Yorkers lives below the federal poverty line. Meanwhile, housing costs continue to soar. Median rents have risen by 8.5%, but median incomes have dropped by 7%.
I just started and I'm in Sunday school.
Tawana Little has lived in New York for her whole life. But for over a year, she and her kids have been forced to live in shelter.
When it came down to the ending of my lease, that was a prime opportunity for the landlord to say, okay, we don't want this program in here anymore.
Tawana depended on a state program that helped her pay the rent. When her landlord raised the price, she was evicted.
He just wanted higher rents?
He wanted higher rents.
So your rent for that place has now gone up to $2,200?
$2,200, yes.
Could you afford that?
Oh, absolutely not.
Tawana is looking for an apartment she can afford. It's a search that's taken her far outside the city, an hour-and-a-half bus ride to Middletown, New York. We met her in Middletown, but the broker who'd agreed to show her around canceled.
So I'm just really in a really bad emotional place right now. I'm not feeling the greatest. I feel like it was just a pure waste of time.
To salvage the trip, she decided to look anyway.
What's it like doing the search while you're in a shelter? Is it hard?
When you're in a shelter, it's doubly hard. You're not really comfortable. But I tell you, if I would rather come out here and take a look and doing what I need to do to get my family up out of that circumstance, opposed to sitting there not doing anything.
Do you see yourself living here?
No.
No?
I don't know. I don't know yet.
Do you know a lot of people here?
No. Not at all.
Do you have a lot of friends and family in New York?
In the city? Yeah, absolutely. It's where I grew up at, so I know my areas.
Do you feel like you've been forced to leave the city?
With the rents that as high as they are, yes. Yes. Middle-class people in the city are not being really catered to. They're busting their behind working every day constantly, like to the point where, you know, they're not even sleeping, you know? And if they miss a paycheck, then that's a possibility they can be where I am. And that's the realism of it.
Whose city? Our city. Whose city? Our city. What do we want? Affordable housing. What do we want? Affordable housing. When do we want it? Now.
We're in the middle of a rally with hundreds of New Yorkers from East New York, a working class neighborhood in Brooklyn. People here are demanding that at least half of the new houses built here are affordable to them.
They want to push these people out because apartments are going to be so high, they're not going to be able to afford it.
Under its last mayor, Michael Bloomberg, New York City lost more than 1/3 of apartments considered affordable to poor families.
And what we're seeing now is the effects of 20 years of housing policy. 20 years of people, little by little, being pushed out. No attempt to house these human beings.
And homelessness the number is rising every day.
There's a lot of homelessness right here?
Right here. People are getting priced out, pushed to out of state.
New York City, under the Bloomberg administration, eliminated entirely the permanent housing programs which were designed to help homeless families and children leave the shelter system.
Under Bloomberg, the number of people in homeless shelters each night went from 31,000 to 54,000.
Essentially what we had was a massive social experiment to test the proposition that if you take away permanent housing assistance from the neediest children and families in our city, what will happen?
How you gonna have high rents and no good jobs?
Every day in this city, people are losing their homes. If we do not act, New York risks taking on the qualities of a gated community.
Mayor Bill de Blasio was elected in 2013 on a promise to reverse New York's growing economic inequality.
The city has for decades let developers write their own rules when it came to building housing. This administration is taking a fundamentally different approach.
De Blasio has vowed to create and preserve 200,000 affordable units. His plan relies on tax incentives to developers.
If you're a developer, if you set aside 20% of those units for low-income folks, the city will give you tax breaks on that property.
Robert Robinson is a housing advocate who's formerly homeless.
I would challenge Mayor de Blasio and say your plan is no different than Bloomberg's plan. 80% market rate, 20% low income. The more you create housing like that, you're saturating the market with market rate housing. Developers in this city, they want to profit as much as they can. So their heart is not into building houses for poor people. That's not their goal. Their goal is to get market rate rents.
New York's largest existing stock of affordable housing is the 1 million apartments that are rent regulated under state law. But the trend is clear. Since the early 80s, nearly 20% of these have been converted to market rate.
Hi, Shaniqua?
Shaniqua Charles has lived in a rent-stabilized apartment in the Bronx since 1988. By law, her landlord can only raise her rent a small percentage each year. But if she moves out, he can raise the rent by 20%.
This area is going through gentrification, right? So that's no secret. I mean, the writing is on the wall. If you can get these buildings from being rent stabilized, then you can charge $2,500 a month, $3,000 a month eventually.
Shaniqua says she's never missed a rent payment. But 6 months ago, she received an eviction order from her landlord.
I think that's the most helpless feeling I've ever experienced, actually. Yeah,
What was your biggest fear at that moment?
Being homeless. And you don't think rationally when you don't think rationally when you think you're going to lose your home.
The number one cause of family homelessness in New York is eviction. In 2012, more than 1/3 of families who applied for shelter had recently been evicted.
We've got 33,000 people who've been evicted across New York City in the last 2 years. 33,000 families?
Shaniqua's building has 50 code violations.
The apartment was full of lead. There were like holes in the walls. The bathroom ceiling almost collapsed. This will probably fall down at any minute.
Last spring, she asked for repairs. One day, a crew arrived and demolished her bathroom.
My daughter came in, I recorded her. She was like, "What is this?"
How can I take my bath?
I don't know.
It makes me angry.
It makes you angry?
Yeah.
Why does it make you angry?
Because it's like ruined.
It's ruined.
It's really ruined.
Hopefully the landlord will fix it, right? We didn't have a bathroom for over a month. We were like packing our bags every night to find somewhere to bathe. It's frustrating because my rent is paid.
Owners are not viewed favorably by anybody. I think we are probably somewhere on the bottom next to real estate agents or bankers.
Joseph Strasberg is the president of the Rent Stabilization Association, a lobbying group for landlords.
Every economist will tell you that any artificial controls do not work.
Explain this to
Anyway,
me.
sorry.
You're called the Rent Stabilization Association, but you're opposed to rent stabilization.
That's correct. That's correct. Government requires so many rules and regulations that they impose on owners. Many of them are small property owners, not very sophisticated.
But you know, even with all these regulations, there's still this constant flow of people who are getting evicted. And I'm just wondering what you would say to a homeless family that was evicted out of a rent-stabilized building.
Oh, well, if they've been paying the rent, how did they get evicted?
I mean, we've met just in the past month, we've met so many families who've been...
But if they've been paying their rent, there is no way they could be evicted. If they were evicted, it was done illegally. But owners, they're not in the business of providing social services. That's government's responsibility.
Every day we read stories about repairs not being done, people being harassed, they don't get heat, they don't get hot water. Gentrification doesn't just happen. It is a system, and it is done systematically. There are ways to legally push people out. It's only illegal when you get caught.
Crown Heights, Brooklyn. More families from this neighborhood have entered the shelter system than from any other in New York.
I've been here a long time, and I think I'm a senior, and I listen to some of the rents that these people are paying. I can't afford that.
I've heard stories at the tenant union about them.
We're at a tenants meeting called by Keisha Jacobs, who lives in this building.
I could be homeless too. You know, any one of us could have a situation where something happens and we lose money, lose your apartment. Any one of us could find ourselves without our home. Come on in.
The building is rent stabilized, but Keisha was the last paying tenant to move in.
People told us when they were leaving, they were like, this building is about to change drastically.
She started to notice bunk beds and mattresses being moved into the building, so she asked the building supervisor what was happening.
And he was like, oh, those are for the people. I said, what people? And so he was like, oh, for the shelter people.
The city was turning Keisha's building into a type of homeless shelter known as a cluster site, a privately owned building that shelters homeless families.
They're housing families in need of emergency shelter in my building.
The city created cluster sites over a decade ago. As homelessness grew, Mayor Bloomberg increasingly favored paying private landlords for shelter.
The folks who own this building are really making lots of money from these people, and so, you know.
Keisha's landlord is a prominent real estate family called the Podolskis. They own about 40 cluster shelters. Since 2010, the city has paid them over $90 million to house homeless families. 4 of their shelters are in Keisha's neighborhood.
So this is pretty typical. Door wide open, broken into and broken mailboxes. My building is owned by the same people who own this building, and we're trying to improve the conditions in the buildings that he owns. You know, this guy thinks that because the families are homeless, they have no power. And just because a family is in crisis doesn't mean you should be making millions of dollars off of me.
The cost of living has skyrocketed. You know what I mean? And then I gotta pay utilities. Okay, but then I have 2 kids, and then I have to get to work, and I have to buy food.
Do you know how much the city pays for these apartments?
Our budget letter shows that, which is basically like what they pay for our rent, pretty much like the breakdown.
The money that public assistance is paying for us to stay here, that can be given to us in vouchers and to find better places to live.
I'm sure you know how much the city is paying to house families in crisis.
Yeah, basically, this is the first time.
This is Shaquana Ryan. 10 months ago, she and her family applied for shelter. The city moved them into this apartment.
Okay.
So what's this?
This is the budget letter.
Every month, Shaquana receives a budget letter from the city.
Is this how much money that the city's paying your landlord?
Yeah.
Like for this apartment? Mm-hmm. It's $2,700. $2,737.50. Yep. That's a lot of money. You think this apartment is worth that much? Nope. No way.
Shaquana's building has 115 open code violations. That's an average of 5 violations per unit. She says she's asked for repairs, but she's still waiting.
The windows ain't fixed. The first hallway light don't come on. The socket in the kitchen is not even covered up.
Right now, about a quarter of all homeless families with children each night are sleeping in these cluster site shelters, essentially sleeping in apartments, and we, the taxpayers, are paying a ridiculous amount of money for that.
What would you do with that money if the city gave you that much money?
Get a better apartment.
Yeah?
If they paying $27 for me to stay here, then they might as well pay $27 for me to get my own apartment.
But you think other tenants in the building are paying $2,700?
No.
How much do you think they're paying?
Less than that, I don't think 27.
I want folks to understand that if it wasn't for this program, that because this apartment is rent stabilized, you could possibly just afford to be living here.
Wait a minute. So paying tenants in the building, the average rent is $900.
Right.
And the city is paying up to $3,000?
Yes.
For the same apartments?
Yes. It seems so ridiculous that you would remove affordable housing stock from working families to house people in crisis and then turn a profit. Why are people looking for a shelter elsewhere when they're already in a dwelling that's rent stabilized? It doesn't make any sense to me.
When Mayor de Blasio was elected, he promised to phase out cluster sites. But in the last year, his administration has actually added 225 cluster units.
We are facing high numbers, and we have to ensure that everyone is safely placed.
Camille Rivera is the Deputy Commissioner of New York's Department of Homeless Services. It's the agency that oversees the city's shelters. Tell me about the cluster site program.
What about the cluster site?
The cluster site shelters. It seems like the city is paying private landlords quite a bit of money for these apartments, you know.
Well, actually, I would disagree with that. We've worked over the last year and a half since the administration first came into office to reduce our reliance on clusters.
But last year, the city actually increased the number of cluster units by 8%.
We still reduced our reliance on it.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that we are focusing more on purposeful built shelters that provide more robust social services for our families with children.
A lot of the families we've spoken to, we've seen their letters, and they're saying that the landlord is getting paid $2,700, and there's people in the building paying rents of $500 to $1,000.
The letters that people get include what's called social services and aftercare components. So it's not something that we're paying the landlord that amount of rent, and I think that is something that's out there that's not true.
How much of that $3,000 or whatever the amount is ends up going to the landlord? Is there a formula?
There is a formula. We're not going to discuss that formula.
Let me tell you about one woman we met. She has 2 little kids. In her building, there are nearly 5 violations per unit. What is DHS doing about buildings that have these open code violations?
We work with our sister agencies. We work with our providers to make sure they get fixed.
I mean, the families were concerned.
Okay, we're moving on.
Just last question, the families.
We're moving on.
They've created a situation where they can't sort of back out of this program. They need it because they need to have housing for homeless people, but they've privatized it. And so once you do that, you've made a deal with the devil now.
We don't need any more buildings turning into shelters. We need housing. So
it's been 2 months since we met Tawana Little. She's still living in shelter and looking for an apartment she can afford.
You have to come up with your own scenarios as far as how you're going to get yourself out of this situation, because you really don't have very much support. I really don't think that they've put much effort into understanding what this crisis is. I think that they're throwing money at it. That's where all of these shelters are coming up from, because they're constantly just throwing money at things. But they're really not getting into what the problem is and dealing with the issue.
You can keep finding places to warehouse bodies. Doesn't end the problem. It doesn't work towards a solution that might end the problem.
In 2014, the overall number of families in shelter rose by 13%.
Money is being made. It is just like the homeless population might as well be traded on the stock market. How much are the homeless worth? What we know about in this city and in this country, if something is really costing you money, you do something about it.